So this video is going to look at your issue and debate, so the bit that you're going to get an essay question on within GCSE psychology, specifically linked to memory here. So what is reductionism and holism? And your job is to decide which bits of memory research and theory that you studied you could define as either reductionist or holistic. So let's start. Reductionism is the argument that all psychological phenomenon can be reduced into simple parts, hence reductionism, because it's the idea of reducing down an explanation. So by this, I mean that we would take something really, really complicated and really big, and we would break it down and try and explain it as a product of something really simple. So for example, if you think about like depression, we would say, or certain scientists would say, all depression is caused by a neurotransmitter called serotonin. And that's a very reductionistic approach because you're obviously ignoring all the other things that could be causing depression, such as social factors or life events. So if somebody's died in the family, if there's genetics, etc., etc. But you're ignoring all of those and you're reducing that explanation down to one really simple thing. Now, because you're doing this, then you're also claiming that that behaviour is really predictable because it comes from one certain factor. And any explanation of behaviour at its really simple level can be therefore deemed reductionist. And we can use reductionism as a criticism, where we're saying that a theory is reductionist because it reduces something really complex, like memory, for example, down to something really, really simple, and it ignores other factors. So as we go through, we'll start applying some of this to some of the stuff that you studied within memory research within psychology. So for example, here we would look at the multi-store model and we would say that that is really reductionist because it reduces really, really complex things such as memory down to three really straightforward stores: the sensory, the short term and the long term. It doesn't really go into explain any sort of the complexities within this, so it doesn't explain different types of long-term memory, different types of short-term memory, etc., etc. It just reduces it down to something really simple. So we might say that the multi-store model is reductionist. Now, reductionism can actually be really helpful to us because what it does by reducing something down into something really, really simple is it allows us to try and work out what certain things are causing behaviour. So, for example, we might look at something in real detail. So I appreciate that this is memory, but if you go back to the example that I gave you about depression, if we know exactly one neurotransmitter, one thing that causes depression, then we can create one drug that fixes that one thing, and then in theory we can cure depression. So reductionism isn't just a criticism within psychology, it can be really, really useful to us. So again, if we can explain all of human memory down into one model, like the multi-store model, then that's really useful to us because we could use that to work out what causes brain damage and memory damage and how we can improve memory damage and how we can improve people's ability to transfer information from short-term and long-term, etc. It's also really, really scientific because this idea of reducing something down to one common cause or one common theme is a really scientific way of looking at things, and it allows us to test it. So for example, if we're saying all of memory, no matter how complex it is, can be explained by three boxes or three stages, so sensory, short term and long term, then that's really scientific because we can test that then and we can do different experiments to prove whether we've got a sensory term, a short term and a long term store. However, as we've already mentioned, it can be a real weakness of psychology when we apply in reductionism, because it then leads us to really oversimplify what can be really complex things. So for example, just through studying memory, we know that there's different types of memory. We know that we encode differently. We know different stores have different capacity and different people have different brain damage. We also know that even things like long-term memory, we know that we might remember something because it means something to us emotionally, or we might remember something because it meant something to us personally, or we might just remember something because it was random. But actually, if we just explain the whole of memory like the multi-store model does by saying it's got a short-term, a sensory and a long-term store, then that's really oversimplifying what can be really complex and therefore causing us to ignore really important parts of it. And therefore, the second point here is it isn't taking into consideration other factors. We're ignoring other things that might be playing a part on our memory, such as how many books we read when we're younger, or how well we're doing at school, or things that might influence memory or impact upon memory, we're just ignoring. So some examples of where we can see reductionism throughout the memory module. I've obviously used multi-store model as a really good example throughout this, But Peterson and Peterson's research, again, is really, really reductionist because they're explaining short-term memory into having a certain capacity and a certain duration. They're using memory research to say that all of memory works in a certain way. They use trigrams, for example, and then they apply that and say, well, all of memory encodes in exactly the same way, even though they use trigrams, and that isn't necessarily reflective of how we learn in everyday life. Now, because of this, because they remove that ability to rehearse as well, that's reducing memory down to simple things, because we know in real life we do actually rehearse information in order to be able to allow us to remember things. If I said to you, I need to go to the shop and buy these 5 items, milk, bread, I don't know, you would say them on repeat to yourself to make sure that you remember them when you go into the shop. Peterson and Peterson also did a lab experiment as well, so it was really strict conditions with really harsh controls in place. Therefore, again, reducing all the time, trying to reduce what affects memory down all the time, and therefore we can say it's reductionism. It also only looks at one aspect of short-term memory, so it totally ignores any other explanations as to why we forget things or how we encode things, how we remember different bits of information. And it does quite a simple experiment and then tries to explain memory in quite a simple way. So we would use that as an example of reductionism within psychology. Now, holism is the exact opposite of reductionism. So this is when we look at the whole picture of something. Rather than breaking it down and trying to explain it as a result or a product of one thing, we actually look at the whole person or the whole thing, and we include lots of different factors. So for example, we might say, right, okay, this person has depression. Well, I want to understand, I want to know what's going on with their neurochemistry, and I want to know how their neurotransmitters are functioning. But I also want to know how their hormones are and what their life circumstances are, and I want to know about their relationship status, and I want to know where they live and how much money they earn. And you would get a full picture about that person before you tried to explain what had happened to them or a certain diagnosis such as depression. Again, linking to memory research, if we were taking a holistic approach to something, then we would be looking at lots of different factors that can influence or impact upon a person's memory. And we would be using those to explain how we therefore encode or remember information. Now, this is really good because we know that if we're able to look at lots of different things that impact on behaviour, then we're able to get a much more valid understanding as to why something is happening or why memory is happening. And it considers more than one cause, which gives us a really detailed analysis. And I'll explain this in context so it'll make more sense in a minute. However, because we're including so many different things for each different person that we're studying, it can be really, really difficult then to pinpoint exactly what is causing something or what is something is caused by, and therefore come up with explanations of it. So for example, with the memory, if we were to take in how every single person in the world's memory works, and we were to take in their IQ, we were to take in their schooling and how intelligent they are as a child, how many books they read, we were then going to take into account their genetics, so their family, their parents, their grandparents, their ability to remember, all of these different things. It's really good to get a picture of that person and how their memory works, but it can be really difficult then to apply that to other situations and say that that's how everybody's memory works. It's also really not scientific because how do you know what has an impact and how do you know what doesn't? How do you know which things you've included because you felt like you should, but actually they didn't really have an impact? So it can be really difficult when you're using lots and lots of different information to try and explain one thing, to be really clear about what exactly it is that's causing that one thing. So for example, and the best example within memory research of where we've got a holistic approach is to do with Bartlett and schema. Because the really good thing with schemas is if you think about it, schema does explain why we all remember things differently, because it represents the fact that we've got different cultures, different beliefs, different religions, different ways of learning information. We all learn, for example, what a bird is in different ways. You might have learned that the first time you went to a zoo. I might have learned that because I saw one in the garden. Someone else might have learned that because they saw one in a book and their parents explained what that word meant. So it's an explanation of memory that allows us to explain how and why people remember things in different ways, and why in a class, for example, I would give you all the exact same information and 16 of you can remember it, 14 can't. But those schemas gives us an explanation which fits everybody, this idea of pre-existing knowledge and understanding, but it also explains why some of you remember and why some of you don't. So it's quite a holistic approach because it allows us to take into account lots and lots of different factors that would affect those schemas and therefore why you all remember differently. Now remember, Bartlett's study is an example here of a holistic study again, because Bartlett wanted to see how people or participants and how their background knowledge and their pre-existing experience influence their experience of an event. So he read the more the War of the Ghost study, and he wanted to see how their pre-existing experiences affected their memory recall of the study. But what's interesting is his approach to this was to talk to them about their backgrounds, where they were from. He spoke to them about their jobs, their families, their hobbies. So he got a really kind of rounded picture of his participants before he drew his results together as to exactly what was impacting or affecting that memory recall. Because this is your issue and debate within memory as a topic within the GCSE, it's actually the only situation within paper 1 where you're going to get a 9-mark question. And again, it doesn't mean that you're definitely going to get one, but it means if you are going to get one, it's going to be on an issue and debate. And obviously your issue and debate for memory is reductionism and holism. So there's an example on the board of something that you might get here. So Cornelius conducted lab experiments to investigate how short-term memory is affected by interference. He played loud music to his participants while they were trying to remember a list of digits. Assess to what extent memory research is reductionist. Well, if you look here, it's a 9-mark exam, so it's quite straightforward in terms of what it wants from you in terms of assessment outcomes. So it wants 3 marks for AO1, 3 for AO2, and 3 for AO3. So we know that that means we need our essay to be divided into thirds, really. We need to be describing what reductionism is, what holism is, and if we're talking about a theory, what that theory is in terms of describing it. The AO2 is then going back to Cornelius and his lab experiment and be able to link in what we're saying back to that situation that we were given. And the AO3 then is going to be the evaluation. So this is good because, or this is helpful to us because, why can reductionism and holism within psychology be helpful? But then we've also got to say this isn't helpful because, and we've got to be able to break it down then. You know your basic structure in terms of a 9-marker in terms of what the exam wants from you. So you know that your AOs have got to be weaved. So a really good structure and approach to this would be to make an AO1 statement. So reductionism is. This can be seen through Peterson and Peterson's study. Then make an AO2 comment. So this links back to Cornelius and his study because blah, blah, blah. And then an AO3 where you might say, reductionism within psychology in this sense can be really used to us because it will help us to explain memory in really simple and simple terms, etc., etc. And then you might put a however if you want that higher level where you say, however, this isn't useful to us though because it ignores lots of different factors that can be included within memory. And then you'll repeat. You've got to make sure you've got a conclusion as well. And just an idea, just some tips here. Remember with the mark scheme, this never changes. The keywords here are the same ones that we've looked at the whole way through. Your AO1 needs to be accurate and thorough. So if you're going to talk to me about the multi-store model or Peterson and Peterson or Bartlett's study, I want detail. I want to know that you really understand what happened within that study or that theory and why that's important. Your AO2 has got to be sustained, so that means you're not just going to put the word Cornelius in once, you're going to refer detailed and throughout as to what it is that he's studying and why that links to the research that you've got. And then your AO3 as well is going to be logical, so it's not going to be waffled and all over the place. You're going to make your evaluation point linked to what you've just said. And it's going to be balanced. So you're not just going to say all of memory research is reductionist and it's therefore not useful to us. You're going to give me examples of where it's reductionist. You're going to give me examples of where it's not reductionist. You're going to tell me why it's good that it's reductionist, and you're going to tell me why it's bad that it's reductionist. And you're going to make sure that you put a conclusion at the end with a nice judgment answering the question.